It's currently 2025, so you'd probably imagine that there's some seriously cutting-edge tech managing our skies. And in a lot of cases there are. But the actual scene in many air traffic control towers around the world are old square monitors running Windows 95 and data being passed around on floppy disks. Yep, that's the same Windows 95 from the era of dial-up modems and the Spice Girls, still in charge of keeping airplanes safely separated. So, the lives of millions of passengers and crew depend on software and hardware from the 90s. It sounds like the setup to a bad tech joke, but it is reality. And, like any good joke, there is a punchline. This ancient infrastructure actually works. Well, until it doesn't, but we'll come to that. So, let's see what this funny business is all about. In April 2025, Newark Liberty International Airport, one of the US's busiest and a major hub for United Airlines as well, had its radar and communication systems fail repeatedly, causing hundreds of flight delays and cancellations as well. The culprit? Not a cyber attack or a new software bug, it was old equipment finally giving up the ghost. And in another wake-up call, an outage in January 2023 knocked out a critical FAA system in the entire nation of the US, forcing the grounding of every flight in America for hours. And these incidents shone a light on an uncomfortable truth. Some of the world's busiest airspaces are managed by aging infrastructure that belongs in a museum. So, how on earth, or how in sky, did we get here? And why stick with technology old enough to legally rent a car? Air traffic control can be described as stepping into a time machine. Back when Bill Clinton was president and Bill Gates was touting Windows 95, the FAA was installing the air traffic control systems that still run today. Therefore, as the decades have passed, plans to modernize it all have been launched. If you live in the US, you may have heard terms such as next gen. But progress on this has been painfully slow. By the FAA's own admission and assessment, over a third of US ATC systems are still made up of unsustainable legacy machines that are, well, starting to fail. And many are so antiquated that finding spare parts is a quest worthy of an Indiana Jones film. Past administrations poured money into upgrades that never really quite panned out, while new projects got bogged down in bureaucracy. And the result? Towers full of tech that hasn't changed since Friends was still airing on TV. But if all of these systems are so ancient, why haven't they been upgraded? Well, it turns out there's some pretty good, if a little bit frustrating, reasons that ATC is frozen in time. So let's break down the main factors keeping air traffic control stuck in the age of the floppy disk. And still using floppy disks as well. We'll come to that. The first reason is that upgrading a nationwide ATC network isn't as simple as popping down to PC World or Best Buy for a new laptop. It's extremely expensive. Transportation officials have floated figures from 12 to 20 plus billion, and really, these days, that's probably a conservative estimate. So why so pricey? For starters, the FAA has to maintain its current operations even when building and integrating a new system, effectively paying for two networks at the same time. Years of underinvestment hasn't really helped either. The FAA's budget for new equipment has actually shrank over time as more money has gone into patching up old hardware. Kind of sounds like old banks. In fact, turns out over 90% of the FAA's technology budget now goes into just keeping those old systems running. And this leaves pretty much only the scraps for new tech. You know, you could call this technical debt interest payments, so I'm going to coin that term. Little wonder that officials then are basically pleading with Congress for a massive cash infusion to tackle all of this, calling it the most important infrastructure project that we, the US, have had in decades. Until the money is secured though, ATC remains stuck with the hand-me-down PCs that are literally older than many of the controllers that are using them. Okay, next reason. In aviation, nothing changes quickly. Any new software or hardware for ATC must go through rigorous testing and certification to ensure that it won't introduce literally deadly errors. And this certification process can take years, and that's even before it starts to get rolled out and deployed. So therefore then, by the time that a new system is fully approved and installed, it might already feel obsolete. And the FAA, of course being a cautious regulator, is bound by procedures that make your local DMV or DVLA look like an agile department. Quoting an analyst here, air traffic control is a 24/7 high-tech operation trapped inside a regulatory agency. And that means that procurement is slow and upgrades roll out at a glacial pace. And because safety is paramount, which is obviously a good thing in this industry, the FAA historically hasn't been allowed to simply just, switch off an old system when a new one is late to the party. They obviously have to keep the ancient equipment running as a backup even when that new technology has been installed. But this overlap here creates a bit of a perverse incentive. Because the old stuff needs to stay around anyway, well, what's the point of spending all that money to implement the new stuff? Whoa, Nelly. My camera's fallen off its mount. No. Oh my lord. Companies pitching new cutting-edge ATC tech also faces a maze of government contracting rules and regulatory oversight. Basically, in short, there's no quick download and install button when lives are on the line. Every line of code is scrutinized. Every server needs to be redundant. And that caution, while very good for safety, can also severely slow down modernization. The result of this is a kind of bureaucratic inertia. If the existing system more or less works, and has the FAA stamp of approval already, then replacing it can seem more trouble than it's worth. It doesn't really help that politics also gets involved too. Closing an outdated radar center or consolidating some facilities might save money, but elected officials will of course fight to keep it open in their district to save jobs. Upgrading ATC therefore isn't just an engineering challenge, it's a political and a regulatory one as well. Alright, reason 3. Windows 95 and other vintage tech in ATC persists partly because they are proven to work. These systems have been chugging along for decades, and therefore they're, finely tuned and pretty battle-tested. Controllers have developed workarounds and expertise to squeeze reliability out of antiquated gear. And in engineering, there's something to be said for stability, of course. All the bugs and quirks of a 30-year-old system are pretty well known at this point. Now, in contrast to this, a shiny new system may have an undiscovered glitch that only reveals itself when a plane is coming in for landing on a busy day. A pretty scary thought. So there's an overall cautious mindset here. Don't fix what isn't completely broken. But even when the fixes are needed, ATC faces a unique challenge. Downtime just isn't an option. Unlike your gaming PC, you can't just shut down an air traffic control center for a few hours to install some Windows updates. These systems, of course, run 24/7 by necessity. Every radar sweep, every flight plan update, all has to occur in real time, or planes start falling behind schedule, or worse, there's a traffic conflict. And this continuous operation requirement means that any transition to a new technology must be instantaneous, seamless, and carefully phased in with zero gaps in service coverage. You can liken it to the infrastructure version of swapping out a plane's engines mid-flight. Understandably then, that makes engineers and FAA officials pretty cautious. The legacy system may be old, but it's a known quantity that's never taken a day off. Well, maybe that one that I mentioned in 2023, but just one day. But by keeping it, you avoid the nightmare scenario of a botched switchover causing a major outage, and you therefore kick the can down the road just that little bit further. Now, of course, as I've just hinted, that assumes that the old system doesn't just break on its own, which, as we've seen, is becoming a relatively risky bet. But until a new system can match the 5 nines, so that means 99.999, so that's 5 nines in total there, then there's this pressure to keep the status quo. So the old IBM and DEC computers hum along in the background, their monotone green and blue screens reliably, if primitively, guiding planes home, at least on a good day. Okay, reason number 4. A modern air traffic control system promises all sorts of digital efficiencies, but with that comes the exposure to the wild world of internet cyber threats. One perk of running a system literally straight out of 1995 is that it's largely isolated from today's internet-based dangers. Data isn't streamed, it's literally, I kid you not, walked around on floppy disks in many cases. You can't remotely hack into a floppy disk that an employee carries to a machine, not that I know of at least, and so therefore there's no online backdoor when the network involves hand-delivering a disk. And to prove this point, this antiquated setup likely actually saved US air travel in July 2024 when a supposedly routine software update from cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike went horribly wrong and crashed thousands of modern Windows systems worldwide. I'm sure you remember that one. Meanwhile, airports and airlines that had newer connected systems were hard hit by blue screens of death. But the vintage Windows 95-based ATC systems, well, they chugged along relatively unaffected. Being behind the times actually likely protected ATC from a cutting-edge fiasco. So ironically, security by outdated design is still security. But don't feel too comforted. Those same systems also have zero modern security patches. If a bad actor, for example, did gain access, let's say an insider or someone who infects a floppy disk that ends up in an ATC tower, the legacy OS wouldn't really put up much of a fight. And as time goes on, and as ATC technology slowly does connect with more external systems, for example, feeding data to airlines or to international networks, vulnerabilities will still grow. The FAA knows, therefore, that any new system must be fully hacker-proof, because a single breach of air traffic control could completely paralyze aviation nationwide in the US, with, of course, many ramifications and effects on the wider globe. I mean, if you think about it, ransomware freezing radar screens or false data being injected into flight paths, that would be chaos. And that prospect, of course, makes many officials nostalgic for the old unplugged days. One of the reasons that the modernization of ATC has been so slow is the insistence that cybersecurity is baked in from day one for any new system, which adds more time, more cost, and more complexity. Meanwhile, the current setup is a double-edged sword. Safe from remote hackers, but dangerously outdated in every other sense. Okay, it's easy to have a laugh at the idea of an air traffic controller feeding floppy disks into an old beige PC. But the consequences of this legacy tech are a little bit less of a laughing matter. I've already mentioned the Newark airport outage that happened earlier in 2025 that grounded flights for thousands of passengers. So let's have a look at that one a little bit more. During those incidents, controllers literally lost the ability to track or talk to planes for harrowing 30 to 90 second stretches, which is an eternity when you've got jets flying close to the ground at 250 miles an hour. Some traumatized Newark controllers had to actually take stress leave to recover from that chaos. And these failures weren't random flukes, they were directly tied to decades-old equipment faltering after years of underinvestment and band-aid fixes. Then there's the other incident that I mentioned at the beginning of this video that occurred in January 2023, when the FAA's Notice-to-Air mission system, which sends vital safety alerts to pilots, went down due to a damaged database file in an aging software environment. And the result of this? For the first time since 9/11, every flight in the US was grounded on that winter morning. Investigations later found that budget constraints had repeatedly delayed replacing the system that had failed. So essentially it had failed because it hadn't been updated since the dial-up era. Now that outage caused massive travel disruption, but it could have been worse. I mean, imagine if critical radar or the collision avoidance systems had failed instead. That near-miss scenario was a wake-up call to just how urgently ATC needs new infrastructure. And of course, the tragic mid-air collision over Washington DC that happened earlier in 2025 is under investigation to see if any antiquated ATC procedures or systems have played a role. But on the flip side, there are some almost charming quirks to the old ways. For instance, in some control towers, you'll still find controllers literally using paper flight strips, little printed pieces of paper for keeping track of flight data by hand. Yeah, I'm not joking. They'll jot down some notes and physically pass along strips as a plane moves from one sector to another. This method dates back over half a century, yet it persists because, well, it works most of the time. It's of course absurdly low tech, but there is a robustness to it. Paper doesn't crash or get hacked. But, that said, when your backup plan in 2025 is essentially grab your pencil and paper, it's pretty clear that the system's probably due for an overhaul. Then of course there's the floppy disk anecdotes that I've been getting at. I can imagine that one of the hardest parts of the job for an ATC intern is finding a working floppy drive. And good luck if that disk gets corrupted. Those things aren't exactly sold at your local Best Buy anymore. Fun fact, San Francisco's BART train control system, one similar in criticality to ATC, also still runs on a DOS and boots from a 5.25-inch floppy disk, with an upgrade pushed off until at least 2030, of course due to budget issues. So yeah, some transport infrastructure won't fully ditch floppies until some people have started flying to space with Jeff Bezos. It really does put different tech timelines into perspective, doesn't it? And finally, there's the strange resilience of these legacy systems. Like the aforementioned CrowdStrike saga, while airlines and airports with newer IT went into meltdown, the ATC folks running Windows 95 barely noticed a thing. Their systems were too old to even run the faulty update that caused the crash. So as the world moves on to cloud computing and AI, an old 486 computer in a tower somewhere said, nope, I'm going to stick with what I know. Now that doesn't mean the old system is good, far from it, but that stubborn dependability occasionally pays off in some weird ways. Air travel is touted as a marvel of modern engineering, from state-of-the-art jets themselves to things like GPS-based navigation. And it is. But lurking behind that modern facade is an ATC backbone that hasn't aged quite as gracefully. It's both fascinating and terrifying that in 2025, critical national infrastructure runs on technology old enough to have children. But the reasons why that this is the way that things are a little more nuanced. It's not simply laziness or neglect, although there's been a little bit of that, but a cocktail of cost, caution, and complex bureaucracy. ATC officials aren't exactly fans of Windows 95 or floppy disks. They're actually aware that the system needs to be dragged into the 21st century, but as we've explored today, when you're dealing with thousands of flights and millions of lives, you tend to err on the side of leave it alone until we're absolutely sure. Now, the dilemma here is pretty high stakes. Risk disruption now in order to prevent catastrophe later. And for years, later was someone else's problem. But really, later is now. Now, the push for modernization is finally getting some momentum. The US Transportation Secretary and the FAA leadership have essentially said, enough is enough. No more floppy disks, no more paper strips. They formed industry coalitions, ran 1980s nostalgia TV ads about outdated tech, no, seriously, and practically begged Congress for the funding to build a brand new air traffic control system. There's rare bipartisan agreement here that this upgrade is essential and urgent. Tens of billions of dollars are likely going to be spent, and plans are being drafted as we speak. But money and plans are the easy part. Execution is when things get real. Will the new system roll out smoothly, or will we still be joking about Windows 95 when Windows 2035 is out? Skeptics point out that we've heard this before. Grand ATC modernization efforts that fizzled out amid delays, overruns, and politics. This time though, the pains of the old system are getting a little bit too obvious to ignore, and the technology gap too wide to paper over. The next mid-air incident or major outage will just be one too many, just like the ones that have already happened. So the next time you're on a flight and you hear a cryptic announcement,
ladies and gentlemen, we're facing a slight delay due to technical issues talking to the control tower,
you might just spare a thought for a poor soul in that tower who's trying to coax a prehistoric computer to reboot. With any luck and a lot of funding, the aviation authorities will finally retire these museum pieces and implement systems worthy of the modern jet age instead of the AOL one. Until then, we'll be flying on a wing, on a prayer, and on a 90s operating system. Thank you everybody for cruising on this journey back to the 90s with me on this Funny Business episode. I really enjoyed making this, as you might have been able to tell, even with my camera falling over halfway through the recording. I even turned my studio sky blue for this one to give us a little more of an airy ambiance. If you enjoyed this deep dive into why our high-tech world sometimes runs on much lower tech, then please do give this video a like. It does really help out a lot. I want to know, have you ever spotted a floppy disk in the wild? Do you remember Windows 95? Or like me, were you not even born when Windows 95 was released? I was a Windows XP baby myself, but yes, do let me know in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, watch out for those floppy disks hiding in your modern machinery. Okay, if you enjoyed this video, I think you're really going to enjoy my next video as well, that continues on the theme of floppy disk mania. So do subscribe to Funny Business for that if you haven't already. But for now, I think you'll really enjoy this video on why big banks still use legacy infrastructure that can be traced back in some form to the 1950s. So, I'll see you in that one. Whoa, Nelly. My camera's fallen off its mount. No. Oh my lord. Right, well, this is going at the end of the video. What's happened? Oh, I feel it. There we go. There you go, you bastard. Right. We're okay. We're okay. I think we're okay. Okay, I think we're okay. I'm gonna check the mount. Okay, well, that's a blooper going at the end.